Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Thank you. So welcome, council and staff. Councillor Beattie is going to join us in a couple minutes. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Joining me in council chamber is our CAO, Ms. Thompson, and our city clerk, Ms. Defoe. And having said that, I will turn the meeting over to the clerk, Ms. Defoe.
Through you, your worship, item 2 is declarations of pecuniary interest. Are there any declarations? And if so, please state the general nature thereof.
Seeing none.
Item 3 is a presentation by the Director of Corporate Services on municipal budgeting, and I will turn it over to our Director of Corporate Services.
I'm just going to get my screen share going on here and hopefully get us going here. I'll try to keep this as on schedule as I can, so bear with me. Okay, so thanks again for this opportunity to present this information to council. The intent for this information is that it's to supply council with some broad-based tools and concepts to help us when we get to the budget conversations. I just want to confirm or affirm that this that our draft budget, when you do receive it, is made up of various inputs, and it's not just separate requests or different divisional budgets. It's presented as an overall corporate city budget. We're not intending to start deliberations or talk about any budget components tonight, but just get some basic background and introductory information. And also I ask members of council to take notes of specific items as I work through this presentation. There will be a couple of opportunities throughout to pause and ask some questions or see if there's any things that we want to talk about further. And certainly at the end of the session, we can certainly, have takeaways as well. So here we go. So the objectives of today's presentation is I want to talk about why we budget and what it's all about. Our roles and responsibilities of the various people involved in this process, and some of the other topics that I've got listed here, but I won't get into too much. We'll touch on them as we get there. So one of the things I just want to start off with, and you'll hear me say this throughout the budget process a few times, is that budgets are estimates. They're based on our best information available at the time. So they are subject to change from this point forward, as well as throughout the year, even post budget. So one common misconception about budgets is that it's all about setting the spending limits, but really the intent of it is to also outline our work plans, our priorities for the year, and just include all of the initiatives that we have planned for the year, even if there isn't a taxation impact. So we're trying to demonstrate to council and members of the public what our plan is for the year on specific services and specific areas. If we have, for example, an example I used here was that if we have a grant that we're expecting, we do want to include that grant as projected or expected revenues and have the offsetting costs, even if there is no levy impact, just to demonstrate that that's part of our intended activities for the year. And the budget really is a key performance metric for the management team, the CAO, and council to assess how we met our objectives for the year. Provincial legislation does require that municipal governments deliver a balanced budget. And by definition, this means that revenues from all sources, which include taxation but are not limited to taxation, must equal all expenditure types. So we don't plan for any surpluses or deficits. We don't plan for having money available for things that crop up in the year, but we do have access to what I would call reserves or reserve funds that might be earmarked for specific things, but not necessarily attributed to a specific project. But when surpluses or deficits do occur, we continue to balance our budget and our financial statements at the end of a year by flowing those surpluses or deficits through a tax stabilization reserve. So the reserves really utilized to capture any variances from our budget. And if we do end up with surpluses, the intent is to repurpose those or redirect those back to the ratepayers as an indirect benefit by sort of augmenting our current year budget. So you will see when we get the budget presented in front of you that there will probably be a draw upon the tax stabilization reserve to utilize prior year budget or prior year surpluses, pardon me. So we also want to include through the budget process a thorough analysis of any revenue options for any programs and services. We want to do this because we're trying to mitigate any impacts to the taxpayers. So we assess revenue options like grants, donations, user fees, amounts recovered from other shared service providers as well. We also want to include a thorough analysis of all peripheral costs. So when we're looking at things like what tenders cover or what they don't cover, we want to include things like legal or engineering costs or impacts for any in-kind costs or even revenues for that matter, or benefits. So it's not just a dollar exercise, it's really to try to capture the full cost of delivering a particular service. And we also want to assess whether our current capital, financial projections, human resources, if they're sufficient to maintain the current level of service, or if there's something that additional that we require. So an example here is that if we're looking at a replacement of equipment, then it's typically included in the capital budget. But if it's smaller dollar value, sometimes that may show up under supplies or repairs and maintenance as a less identified type of spend. So we do try to highlight the larger items that way. And so when we do identify, or if we identify any resource shortfalls or changes to the levels of service, there's two types that kind of appear as such. Sometimes there's requests to add staffing to perform additional elements of an existing program. So we would identify that as a service enhancement of sorts. But there's also so that would be an example where we've reached the capacity for our current staff levels, and we are looking at maintaining the service levels that we have, but they have additional elements to them. This is a little bit different than a brand new service enhancement or an expansion request, which we refer to as items that are presented with the budget that are not included in the budget calculations in the draft budget, but they represent things that we are presenting for council's consideration. So we look at where might be a service shortfall or where there's a new service identified, and we try to show those or bring those forward as over and above what we currently do. Okay, so expansion requests are presented outside of the draft budget. They're part of the draft budget package, but they become part of the consideration. So any financial impacts for those expansion requests would be on top of what the budget is coming forward. So it's done this way to ensure that council has control and opportunity to have conversation over those changes to the service levels and in investment in any new initiatives. So they're not, I'll say, kind of embedded in the existing costs and the existing revenues that we present. So through the budget deliberation process, we look at specific impacts for each decision. So we can, or I will be able to sort of provide council with a real-time adjustment to things that as we move through the budget process. So if we're looking at, the draft presentation as it stands and a question or a comment comes up as what would happen if we changed this or we added that, then we can certainly see the impact to the budget right away. Okay, so now talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of all of us through this process. We all have a role to play. Council as a whole did hear the other day some of the roles that they have as far as responsibilities in the Municipal Act, but just touch on those briefly. One thing I should mention about this presentation is you will have access to this as part of your budget package after the fact. So, if there's anything in particular that you want to review, you'll be able to do that afterwards. So role of council to represent the public and consider their well-being and interests. And so in the budget process and with the context of the budget, this also includes seeking and receiving feedback from residents around the desired service levels for all of our current and or proposed initiatives. We also are looking to develop and evaluate policies and programs of the municipality and determine what services that the municipality provides. the council wants to ensure that the administrative policies and practices are in place to support their decisions. They also want to look at accountability and transparency, maintain the financial integrity, and to carry out the duties of council. So these are all legislative responsibilities and really all do tie into the whole budget process. But as far as the roles and responsibilities of staff, the role of the corporate leadership team, so the directors specifically and the CAO, we're responsible for the service delivery of the divisions that report to us. We also are looking to ensure that that all of the management team and the administrative support teams are supported and they have the tools that they need. And it's also to ensure that information from all of the upper levels of government and their implications is appropriately shared with council and any relevant staff for that. Corporate management team through the budget process is responsible typically for the line-by-line review of all of revenue and expenditures to ensure that they're complete, that they've had the appropriate level of analysis. They research and explore variables that impact those costs and the service delivery. They're exploring alternatives where it's appropriate in delivering services to ensure that pricing is competitive and that the service is meeting the need and intent. And explanations are available through both the management team and through the directors through the budget process to delve into any specific line items or any specific services. The management team is also looking at commenting on or being familiar with any significant variances compared to the previous year and ensuring that appropriate explanations provided or there's information available to talk about that. And they also support both the corporate leadership team and the administrative support team to make sure that everybody can have the information they need to do their roles. And last but not least, in the staffing end of things, not least is the administrative support team. As the role does vary between divisions and departments, but generally their role is to support the directors and the managers in doing some of the research, providing validations for some of the assumptions, and checking our final documents for accessibility, spelling, and presentation. They're very important part of our process for sure. So I want to talk a little bit about the type of budgeting and the budget methodology. In the past or historically, when municipalities were funded primarily by provincial dollars or got operating grants from the province or the Fed, a common approach to budgeting was to really just look at what was done in the past, add a variation there for inflation, and just kind of operated under the methodology that you use it or you lose it type of methodology. Again, this was sort of the way it worked before, sort of, I'll say, in a time before municipalities were really required to do asset management planning and capital planning and having a better idea of their asset requirements. So once the Public Sector Accounting Board came along and enforced some of those requirements for financial statements and for planning purposes and long-term planning, municipalities got better at providing a more fulsome analysis for their budget process. So really that approach where previously councils would sort of direct staff to come in at a certain level or have only a certain level of increase doesn't really reflect the reality of how inflation is different for varying types of services, how some revenue streams are not adjusted for inflation and are fixed. It doesn't really take into account any, I'll say, sensitivities to fees or anything like that with how our services are delivered. And it's just really to reflect the role of council to set the service level, and it's the role of staff to provide those costs. So, and just due to the heavier reliance on taxation as a revenue stream since these I'll say state changes have happened where provincial funding is not there anymore for the primary operational purposes for the municipalities, it's really the expectation of a greater analysis and accountability to our taxpayers. So in more recent years, the process of comparing actual performance to budget analysis is a more active process than it used to be. And the more common approach now, we refer to it as zero-based budgeting. So this terminology has been around for some time. It's not a, I'll say, what it sounds like, in the sense that that it might refer to a 0% increase. It's more designed to refer to how to maintain the service levels with a 0% change, or you know, with a 0% incremental service change. So that's kind of the background with that sort of example. So I'll give an example here for like traditional versus zero-based, or zero-based budgeting versus you know, what would constitute a non-zero based. So we talk about curbside collection, and we talk about things that you know, in order to where we deal with a contractor and they're looking to meet the current level of service, and they need to replace some trucks to do so. But those trucks maybe are more costly than they used to be because they're meeting a new environmental standard. So that cost, or that increase in the cost, may be greater than just a regular inflationary cost. So this is an example of where the service delivery and the service level really hasn't changed, but that the costs have increased beyond what might be a normal expected inflation rate. So this is kind of the concept of zero-based budgeting. It doesn't mean that you're going to come in at a 0% increase, but it might mean that you have an increase in your cost to maintain your current service level. Okay, another example using curbside collection, but alternative example, is that, you know, the same contractor advises that they can provide an additional service that will benefit residents or result in better diversion rates, such as separating the recycling. This isn't zero-based budgeting. This would represent in the way that the city of Stratford does their budgeting as an increase in the service level, and we would typically identify this as an enhancement request. So again, it's something where we're pulling that out of our regular budget process and identifying it as a change in the service level. Sometimes we would have these not necessarily pulled out if they're minor and small, or they're somehow offset by other efficiencies. They might be, you know, included in the general operating budget, but for the most part, we try to identify these because this is where, you know, council has the most, I guess, the most input, or the most ability to make changes, and that is in changing the service level, whether that be increasing it or decreasing it. Just have a couple of picture-based slides here to kind of give an idea of what our funding has looked like in the last little bit. In 2022, I'm using for our comparator here, we've got property taxes representing about 50%. There's some rounding issues with my thing. That's why my pie doesn't look like it's exactly 50, but and then we've got our own funds. So I'll kind of work from the bottom here. Own funds refers to our use of our internal reserves and reserve funds, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We've got a component here where we get some of our revenues from other municipalities for our shared services. We get a component of our revenues from government grants, and then we get some of our revenues from user fees. And user fees is from like, you know, anything from, you know, licensing fees to water and wastewater rates. So that's kind of how those are grouped. And then to give an idea of municipal expenditures and the type of those, again, in 2022, we've got the bulk of the expenses coming in with materials, supplies, salaries, benefits, services, and contracted services, and maintenance, and that sort of thing. So you can get just a kind of a general sense of where we spend our dollars that way. So I do have a couple, like I said before, a couple of sort of what I call natural pauses in the presentation. So I'd like to see if there's any questions at this point before I carry on.
I did have one. When we're the enhancement with service levels, a lot of the times when there's a change to maintain service level, it also results in an enhancement. How do we kind of separate that out, or
if I could, through the chair, I think what you're asking is how to tell the difference, and really the difference is that we're trying to extract out significant changes to the service levels, and if they're not extracted out, then it's really kind of included in the draft budget. Now, that said, there are some times where we will come with an expansion request that's, let's just say it's for a new software system, for example, for something, and we might bring it forward and say that it's not going to necessarily change the fact that we have to issue permits or we have to collect taxes or anything like that. It's not going to necessarily change the service, but it's replacing something that's obsolete. So we might still highlight those kinds of things if they're material and through the expansion request process. Thanks for the question. Okay. I'll carry on. Okay, so the next part I want to talk a little bit about was what that sort of the difference between operating budgets and the capital program, or capital budgets, we sometimes call it. Really, the operating budget is to try to cover regular and ongoing activities. It's things that are, we call sort of day-to-day type of expenses and revenues. I sort of use general studies or consulting or hydrant flushing, transit services, anything that's sort of the regular day-to-day. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes on day to day. So there's a lot of separate, I'll say, operating budget line items and divisional activity that goes on. And the way that we present the operating budget typically is we show this in a columnar format in your budget package, where you'll see the proposed 2023 budget figures for both revenues and expenses, and then I'll say the net impact by division. And you'll see for comparison purposes, you'll see prior year information. So you'll also see the 2022 budget and the 2022 actuals that are recorded to date. And then you'll see the 2021 actuals and budget recorded to date. I will sort of caveat this, the presentation, which you'll also see. I'll go over this again when we actually get the draft materials out. But you know, we are still working, as most of you will be aware, on the 2021 year end. So there are still some things outstanding that may stick out. But please do ask questions when you see that information, because we're happy to answer the questions. We are also looking at a sort of system and what's required to do a system enhancement to better present a forward-looking budget as well. So we can have a 3-year proposed operating budget as well, so that will show and demonstrate to council any of our inflationary assumptions and any impacts that we anticipate as a result of changes that we might make to capital transfers or to long-term debt, or any other things that, you know, if we say, for example, we knew that we were going to lose a funding stream from the province, like, you know, we could factor that in and then see the impact of that. So that's sort of one of the goals of our budget process, is to get to a little bit more of a bigger picture as well, not just looking at a single year or historical years for that matter. So a couple of other things I'll talk a little bit about is that's a bit of a change, or a bit of a something that we're trying to make a little clearer, and that's what we call interfunctional transfers. So in 2022, you know, we looked at trying to better determine what some of the true costs of services are for various divisions, even though those divisions may not host the actual expense. So this is things where you know, they're not true revenues or expenses for a division, but they're transfers between departments to reflect the real costs of services. So one example I have here to try to illustrate it for you is talking about the IT department. So the IT department purchases and maintains most of the city's software licenses, because they're the sort of primary owner and manager of those services. They then support the divisions that use those licenses. But each division will use them to a different degree, or have certain dependency on certain licenses. So it does kind of go along with the fact that the cemetery management program would only be charged to the cemetery division. So it just kind of gives council a bit of a better sense of where those costs lie to provide that service. Okay, and then so what it looks like is that the IT division will have a cost for that particular license. They will show an internal or an interfunctional recovery revenue that offsets that cost from the cemetery division, and then the cemetery division would have an interfunctional cost. So it's kind of a duplication of transactions, but it makes it easy for us to identify who's paying the bill and who's benefiting, or who the cost belongs to. So it effectively transfers the costs between divisions without duplication. So I just wanted to highlight that because it's a little bit of a change, and it's something that you'll see when you see your draft budget package that exists amongst many departments and many divisions. So I'll be providing more information on that, but it is a bit of a change, or a bit of a way that we're looking at this. We don't typically use interfunctional accounts for reallocating staffing costs. We do that, I'll say, at the back end, or at the initial stages when we are determining total salaries. So we actually allocate those out where it's required from different divisions. So we will have different things where, or different departments where they share staffing resources. So a good example might be the water and wastewater division might have operators that do work for both. So we're allocating costs that way. So we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically when we get to budget, but I just to give a bit of background there. So the types of interfunctional accounts that we currently use are for things like IT, like fleet. So we have a fleet division that does, I'll say, does all the work related to fleet, but then costs, we divvy those costs out to the divisions that are using those pieces of fleet. Maintenance costs, custodial costs, internal rents. So sometimes we'll have costs and recoveries between divisions that for spaces where one division is sort of the primary host of the building, and there's internal rents that are allocated to other divisions. Insurance is another one that gets recovered, like it gets costed in corporate services, but then it's costed out to the different divisions. Telephone is actually kind of goes with IT. It's managed through the IT division. So those will show up this year in the 2023 budget as interfunctional costs for the division, but it's not really a change or in the cost feature so much as it is just an allocation thing. And then lastly, administrative services. So a lot of municipalities are moving towards this idea of corporate overhead. So charging out some of the departments and the costs that are required to run the organization, but aren't necessarily a true service, external service delivery. So it might be things like administrative departments like finance or HR. And so right now the city of Stratford is not on a full corporate overhead costing model. We're looking at usually only costing those out for user pay systems to get a better sense of what those user fees should look like for those divisions and what those costs to run those user fee departments really are. But for all of our other divisions that are not user pay or full user pay, those are not allocated amongst the various divisions. We're just not there yet, and we just haven't really seen a value yet in I'll say all of the different levy-based departments doing that. So you'll see like finance division or HR division just kind of presented as a whole that way. One of the things with developing the budgets, I mentioned earlier that budgets are estimates. So at this point, we're looking at a lot of assumptions that we use to develop the budget. We base it on known information, but we also use staff field knowledge. We look at historic trends. We look at any pending legislative changes to try to estimate what the costs or revenues might be for a specific line item. Past couple of budget years, we've had, I'll say, additional estimates based on a lot of varying information for COVID-19. But for 2023, the effects of that have largely reverted to pre-COVID levels, so that you won't see too much identified in the budgets or influencing the budgets that relates to that. Key assumptions, we've got quite a few of these as we move into the 2023 budget, and we'll talk a little bit more about these when we get into the deliberations about what some of those are. But the primary one is that we're basically assuming that service levels are going to remain status quo. And what that means for us is that it's previously established service levels and previously directed activities from council. So there shouldn't be any huge surprises for anybody that's returning council, but certainly for anybody that's new to council, if there's questions about what our service level really is for a specific area, we'll be talking about that when we get there. Another thing that we estimate is salaries. So we have several collective bargaining units in the organization, and so some of those are due for renegotiation at the end of this year and in 2023. So we make some estimates based on what that's going to look like, but we don't really know for sure how that's going to roll out. So we try to get close, and we're usually pretty close, but it really does depend on how those go. We also look at known and estimated impacts for any changes to employer costs. So we usually have a bit of a notice on changes for CPP or EI rates, EHT rates, that sort of thing, pension and benefit costs. So some of those happen mid-year, so we don't always know in December or November what's going to happen in July of the following year. But again, we can make an estimate, and if there's any significant variances from what we plan on, usually we'll be providing council with, information mid-year if we think that there's going to be a significant impact. So municipal insurance. So this is another area that, in my experience as a treasurer, has been very volatile in the sense that it's constantly increasing, and it's constantly placing more burden on municipalities for responsibility for settling claims and things like that. So for 2023, we've got an preliminary estimate from our insurance provider of about 12%. They're saying a range between 10 and 15. I settled on 12 because I just thought that was a fair, reasonable side of things. If that comes in lower, then, and we'll know this information likely through the budget process, then we can make adjustments, or higher, we can make adjustments on the fly with that if we need to. If it's not significant variance from the estimate, then we wouldn't usually bother to make those changes unless we felt it was important. The other thing that we look at is that we will include in the 2023 budget is, and this term will be familiar with our current council, but for the benefit of new councillors, one of the strategies that's sometimes used by municipalities is to, when we're talking about increases in staffing or even purchasing, changes in purchasing, we sometimes will call that gapping. So what that means is that if we are looking at hiring, say, a new person, and that person isn't really expected by the time budget's passed and an advertisement's listed or whatever, they're not expected to start until July, then we might only include 50% of that salary cost in the current budget. This is it's not an uncommon strategy, but it's not used by all municipalities, because really all it's doing is deferring the impact of that. So we do it sometimes, and it's a strategy that can be used to contain or maintain, mitigate tax rate increases, but it's not something that usually that would be presented as a primary option. So. More assumptions. So we also assume that any provincial and federal grant funding that we've received previously, that unless we're, oh, hang on, sorry, what happened? Hold on a second. Bear with me here, please. Hang on a second here, guys. See my screen okay now?
No, it's not there yet.
Okay.
I'm going to recommend that as you're trying to get that screen back up, just let's take a 5-minute break from the meeting. And let's say we're going to be back at 6:10. Okay, thanks, guys. Oh, you're not logging on. No.
Carmen, can you try re-screen sharing? It looks like it stopped screen
Yeah,
sharing.
I'm just working on that. Just give me a second. Sorry.
Take your time.
Yeah. I don't know what happened there, but my apologies. Is this, which, are you seeing the full?
Yep, we're back. Yeah.
Okay. I'm so
Good.
sorry about that.
Okay. No worries. Okay. It's going great.
I'd prefer to stop using IDS examples in all your cases here, Carmen.
Sorry, Taylor. I've got a few transit ones coming up if that makes you feel any better.
I would just note we are still live and streaming to Facebook for everyone's information.
Yeah. I'll turn the floor back to our director. Go ahead, Ms. Kruger. You're muted.
Thank you, Mayor Ritzma. I do apologize for the interruption.
No worries.
Okay, so as I was mentioning about the assumptions, we're talking about federal and provincial grant funding that we've previously received. Unless we've received notification that it's been discontinued, we expect that it will be recurring for some of our regular provincial funding. We also make some assumptions or some estimates on inflationary impacts, and we use various sources to make those estimates, whether it's consumer price index, whether it's building construction indices or other indicators that try to help us predict what costs might look like. We look at also making some assumptions on what our transfers to capital reserve funds needs to look like. So we have to fund our current 2023 proposed capital projects, but we also need to look at our 10-year capital plan to ensure that it's approaching better funding levels and getting to the point where it's sustainable. We also make some assumptions on efficiencies or other reductions. Sometimes when we make changes to some of our processes, then it can have efficiency effects as well. And the example I've got here is reducing paper or mailing costs as we move towards creating more electronic billing options for tax bills or other types of bills. Another assumption that's a pretty significant one is any new taxation revenues or any impacts from assessment growth. So in 2022, we had increases to residential assessment of about 2%. That does help to offset the effect of rising budgets. But in 2023, it's projected at about just over 8%. So again, these are things that really kind of will come together a little bit more in the presentation, but also just different variables that we have. Some things that we don't include in the budget are things that we don't know about yet. For example, council initiatives or things that might come up through the budget conversations that we've got. Any expansion requests are not included. I've got a couple of specific items on here that have kind of carried forward from prior years, and that's, any initiatives that have been potentially explored with RNG, any future construction costs relating to the hub. We do have some activity going on with the community hub and with the site, the Cooper site, but we don't have full construction costs or plans fully developed for that to include in our budget. Other strategic initiatives that may come out of our budget conversations, and other things I've highlighted here for capital items that might be identified in the asset management plan, but they're not yet captured in our 10-year forecasting, or they're not yet staged for timing, and that's to be upcoming. So just to kind of give a sense that there are some unknowns that we won't be able to include in our budget, even in our 10-year forecast, that we don't have information on yet. So we do our best with what we know at the time, but there are certain things that will continue to crop up that we won't be able to include right off the hop. So one of the most significant items that I'll talk about for the operating budgets for the city is what we call our transfers to reserve funds. So this item will show up in many of the operating budgets, and it shows up as a transfer to reserve fund, and it really is representing how much we need to invest in our capital program. The way the city of Stratford's budget is organized, we don't levy separately for operating versus capital. We just have an operating levy that includes these transfers to reserves that are intended to fund our capital program. So logistically, we transfer those funds that are raised through the taxation system, and we transfer those into those capital reserve funds, and then we pull them back out again when we fund the capital transactions. So for current year activity, it's in and out, but there's also the intent to build those reserve funds to support our 10-year program. The amounts do vary by department because the number of assets or the nature of assets does vary significantly by department, but the intent is to pay for current and future projects. Okay. The 10-year capital forecast that you'll see in your budget package in the next couple of weeks does outline the identified required investment to maintain the current and approved service levels. So we classify capital asset types in our asset management plan based on whether they're considered to be core infrastructure or other. These definitions were sort of pushed out by the province in the some of the legislation that came out several years ago around asset management plans. So it's just the way that they're organized. But in our presentation for council and for the public, we try to group it based on our divisional activities so that it makes more sense for those readers of our information. Okay, so the capital program, again, it's a separate document. It's a separate part of the budget, but it identifies specific projects. Identifies the costs of those projects and any particular funding. So a lot of the times, as we just talked about, those projects will be funded by reserve funds, but sometimes it will be a grant. Sometimes there might be opportunities where we're sharing costs with another partner. So those are identified as the funding sources. So at the end of the day, the capital program is fully funded. That may or may not be true, like sort of in later years if we don't work towards increasing our reserve transfers. But just the point of this illustration here is to just say that the capital 10-year capital and the current year capital doesn't have a direct tax levy impact. It's indirect because of how we do the transfers to reserve. So I just wanted to give a bit of background on that. It's not necessarily obvious to people new coming in or people that aren't familiar with our documents and our process. So capital, when we talk about capital, we're usually referring to tangible capital assets. We're talking about expenditures that are required to make an asset ready for use. It can be things like rehabilitation or significant repairs. And sometimes those can include consulting fees or engineering costs, even those are not technically capital in nature, but they do form part of the costs to make an asset ready for use. So you'll see projects in the 10-year capital that might be a road reconstruction, and there would be items in there that would relate to intangible costs, but certainly needed to make the work ready. So when we talk about the capital forecast, all of the items that are in the current year and in the forecasted should be really ultimately referencing our asset management plan. We're sort of required, or not sort of, we are required to have our asset management plan be sustainable in order and be connected to our funding strategy. And this is true in order for us to be eligible for grant funding for some of these capital programs that we want to apply for. So we really like the emphasis and the movement is really towards making our asset management plan directly connected to our 10-year forecast explicitly, as well as ensuring that the funding program that we have planned for the next 1 to 5 to 10 years is sustainable and achievable. Just a little piece of information I found on the internet when I was getting this presentation ready, that we municipalities in Ontario receive about 9% of all the taxes collected. So this would include any type of tax, but ultimately we're responsible for 50% of the provincial infrastructure. So it does sort of speak to one of the problems that exist for municipalities with trying to maintain all of these assets, this infrastructure, these roads and water and sewer networks, and any types of services that are, I'll say, asset dependent. So as I mentioned, the capital program contains the 10-year forecast. Typically, to support each individual 2023 proposed project, staff will have prepared a detailed information sheet that explains the purpose, the rationale, why that asset is requiring or being requested for replacement, some of the say the risk factors or the opportunities that exist with that particular project. And it's really just to provide more background information for council to make decisions on this. Typically, our budget process is the primary emphasis is on the project's the current year, or the 2023 year in this case, but there is the other 9 years there to show that future years have similar or even more requirements in a lot of cases. So we don't just want to keep our focus on the current year only. Sometimes the timing for the proposed projects becomes a question through the budget process. So, why are we doing this now? This is something that we can, do a different year? Those types of questions, those are great questions, and we should have those conversations through the budget. But there are sometimes other variables that sort of not dictate, but influence our timing. And that would be things like we maybe have a grant funding that has to be spent by a certain time and it's for a specific project. Sometimes an asset reaches at the end of its life and it's not fully functioning, or it's got a risk of failure through the period, or it's approaching that time where like repairs and maintenance costs exceed the cost for replacement. So, and lots of times too, there's a health and safety element that's factored in as well. So if we've got poorly functioning equipment or buildings requiring a lot of infrastructure work, then sometimes those can be tied to the rationale for proposing that. And as we look at things like building repairs and maintenance or things like that, it can also influence our ability to deliver service. So if there's a risk, for example, that a building might be shut down if work isn't done because it's not up to code, or there's a health and safety consideration, then that can disrupt our service levels that we provide. So there's lots of those, a lot of that background information, or those conversations we'll be able to talk about more explicitly with some certain projects that are coming forward. So and sometimes, like I said earlier, sometimes the staging or the timing can be discretionary or fluid, but one of the things I want to make the distinction here is that there is a difference between moving a project to a future year and moving the cost or the funding of that project to a different year. So we talk a little bit about the transfers to reserve funds and the impact on the levy, but really if we look at cutting or deferring a capital project to a future year, we are still going to be proposing that the funding of those projects be included in the capital, or pardon me, in the operating budget. So one of the reasons for that is that the 10-year forecast is significantly underfunded as a general statement. This is true of municipalities everywhere, so it's not just a Stratford issue. But even so, if we reduce a project that's in the capital program for 2023, a proposed project, and we say we're not going to replace a bus, or we're not going to do work at a particular facility, then that particular work, deferring it to a subsequent year, isn't going to gain anything financially. In fact, if anything, it sometimes results in additional costs in the future years due to other inflation and other factors that we don't know are down the pipe. So the transfers to the reserve funds line item in the operating budget's really kind of calculated and determined to try to smooth out those impacts and to build a sustainable level of investment in our assets. So any reduction to the transfers to the reserves would impact future year capital as well as the current year capital. So we'll talk more about this. I just wanted to throw this in here as a bit of an introduction especially for the new council members, just because some of these concepts will be new, and we'll be able to get into them in a little bit more depth when we start talking about real projects and real budgets. So one of the examples I'll give you here, and this is again because this forms part of your reference materials, just so you have it handy. So we're looking at, we have a 10-year capital program. Let's just suppose for ease of illustration that it's a $10 million program. So an average of $1 million every year. The projects aren't usually spread that evenly, and it's not as pretty as that, and there's peaks and valleys. But if over a period of 10 years, we average $1 million, then we need to average $1 million of contributions to the reserve fund in the same breath. So if we look at cutting those transfers to reserves in the year because there's a lower spend in the current year, then we run the risk of having to sort of double up or double down in the following year. So it's just a bit of an illustration to show that, you know, the deferral of doing a project is not necessarily the deferral of the funding component. So a question we often hear at budgets, let's just stretch it out. Can we get another year out of this particular asset? Is this something that we have to do right now? You know, that sort of thing. No, there's always choices. There's always available options for council, but there are risks associated with some of those things. So, you know, service interruptions, equipment failures, decreased service levels, that sort of thing. Like these are all sort of, I'll say, consequences potentially of ongoing or continued deferrals. Okay, we have when you have the aged equipment or infrastructure, sometimes, like I said earlier, there's the health and safety consideration. And really, it really represents an inconsistent application of our asset policies that really estimate our useful lives. So if we plan on doing replacements, for example, for fleet, and we think that trucks are they last 7 years based on our usage of them and the wear and tear, and we stretch that to 8, 9, and 10. Sometimes we do that, but if we don't financially plan for that replacement on a regular schedule, then we can run the risk of it being required replacements when we don't have the cash flow. So it's just kind of to highlight some of those. So that's sort of some of the implications of deferring the project itself. But when we talk about deferring the funding of the project, so basically changing or reducing the transfers to the reserves, some of that, the implication of that is that you can have short-term, I'll say tax levy implications, but those can have longer term impacts. We would sort of be positioning the city to worsen what we call the infrastructure gap or the funding gap for our asset base for future years, and just running the risk that the future replacement might cost more just due to inflation. The other sort of thing is that we don't know what we don't know, and there are often things that crop up over the course of a year or 2 years, 5 years, 10 years that influence what we need to be doing. So we don't know what those are. So it reduces the capacity for the community or for council to make discretionary choices. Okay. I will point out too that for most municipalities, it's unlikely that the infrastructure gap would ever be fully addressed or fully mitigated. So it's one of those things where I think that many councils will have ahead of them the difficult assessments of service level review and really looking at what services we provide, what services are really required for our community, not just what we currently do. Okay. So the 2023 draft budget's been prepared with the intent to increase our transfers to reserves at a steady and sustainable pace. So we're trying to reduce that infrastructure gap to a more sustainable level. And one of the purposes of that is not just for a sort of the practical application of keeping our assets in good repair and being able to deliver our services, but it's also to meet the legislative requirement to have a sustainably funded asset management plan. Okay, and the other piece of this conversation is to just demonstrate that there is a connection between the operating budget and those transfers to reserve funds and the capital program. They're directly connected, but if cutting a capital project, which I'm going to say that's part of the traditional budgeting model to try to save costs, can just have wider reaching implications. So the only real way to substantially reduce the requirement to keep contributing and keep increasing contributions to capital and contributions to our assets is to really look at our services that we provide and what those assets are needed to deliver those services. If you say that we don't need a truck or we don't need a specific type of replacement of equipment, then it can have an implication to the service delivery itself. So again, eliminating assets altogether from our 10-year forecast or our asset management plan would help, but that really impacts the services that we're providing. So I just want to kind of broadly speak to how those are connected to each other. So as I mentioned earlier, expansion requests are treated a little bit differently, and we prepare our draft budgets based on maintaining the current service levels. So items that require additional resources or additional investment are captured here. So like I said, sometimes these will be equipment to meet a service demand. Sometimes it's software to try to improve our processes. Other times it'll be new initiatives that have been identified by staff or by a previous council, or even by recommendations from a ratepayer that have come forward or a community group. And then there's also staffing requirements that sometimes will show up as expansion requests, which may be for additional services, maybe for a newly established strategic priority of council, or it may be that, you know, there's a staffing requirement in order to maintain the current service levels because there's been some, I'll call it, I like the term service creep over the years, and we've reached the capacity in which we can absorb any further actions without changing the service level. But again, these will be identified for you in your package and are certainly available to be discussed through that process. So in these requests, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to outline the benefits of the expansion request to residents or on the operational process, but also the risks of risks to service delivery if we don't move forward with those types of things. So that's just kind of a bit of the lay of the land of that. So good news, about 2/3 of the way through my my actual slides, and I've got another little break here for questions. So I'm happy to take any at this point and at any other time as well.
I see Councillor Hunter.
Thank you. With regard to the reserves, is there any statutory requirement that reserves be a certain size, or is that all just prudence?
That's a great question, actually, and we'll get into this a little bit more when our next section. We'll talk a little bit about reserves and reserve funds. There isn't, for the level of reserves, no, but there are some types of reserves and reserve funds that are restricted to very specific purposes. So I'll use a term that is a little old-fashioned and we don't call it this anymore, but the old gas tax fund, now called the Community Benefit Fund. So we receive that money explicitly from the province for very explicit purposes. And if we don't spend it in a given year, or we want to accumulate it and then spend, you know, multiple years worth at a later date, then we are required to restrict it and to have it only for that purpose. But for most types of reserves, whether it be capital or like any kinds of our different divisions that we have capital reserves for, there isn't anything that's driving or explicitly stating it has to be at a certain level. The only one I would say that would be maybe the closest to that would be those types of services that are fully user pay, where there is the expectation that the rates, for example, I'll pick on a water or wastewater, for example, so they would have the requirement to be fully user pay. So each year when we levy or we ask for certain rates for the water system, we're collecting for the operation of the system as well as future capital replacement. So that one probably is the most directly tied to the capital requirements, like legislatively, but for the most part, there isn't anything that says that you have to have a certain level of reserves, no.
Thank you. I did have one further question, if I could. In terms of, are there any different accounting rules for a municipality versus a private business, for example? And I'm thinking like amortization schedules and things like that.
Yeah, there are quite a few, actually. The municipalities are required to follow public sector accounting guidelines and public sector accounting rules. And there are some that are very explicit. I don't know that I can get into them today, but I'm happy to talk to you about that another time for sure.
Sure.
But there are some so with respect to amortization and things like that, that's still a bit of a, I would say, somewhat discretionary in that we can set our policies on how long we amortize assets over within reason. So there's some of that. The city of Stratford and most municipalities still don't really budget for amortization or budget for those non-cash costs. Instead, we're budgeting for those transfers to reserves and that capital replacement that's kind of in lieu of that. So at the end of each year, please forgive me, everyone else, for this explanation, but at the end of the year, we make adjustments. So we basically exclude those transfers from reserves in our financial statements, and we add back in amortization because that's a required reporting thing. So that's an accounting piece, but definitely we can talk about that another time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anything further? Then we'll carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So talking a little bit about financing tools. So these are the things that we use to try to mitigate the impact on the tax levy. There's a bunch of tools that we have available to us, and we try to utilize these as best we can. One of those is user fees or rates. So previously we're talking about water, but there are several others that are mandated or required to be fully funded by user fees. But we have many other services that are required. By the way, sorry, let me back up. So water and sanitary, those are kind of derivatives for those of you old enough to remember Walkerton, kind of derivatives and outcomes from that whole incident where, you know, the legislation requires that those services be fully user pay so that they are sustainable over time. Building permit and inspection services is a different one altogether. It's a requirement through the building code that, again, user fees for those services pay for those services, so that there's not there's no, you know, you're not making money on it and you're not subsidizing that service from other sources. So but there's many other municipal services that we rely on user fees for to partially fund. So I just listed a few here, but really it's just to give an example. You know, we've got transit fares, we've got licensing, we've got different other things. We have another, I'll say, revenue stream that we do have in our corporate services area, which is referred to as interest and penalties on past taxes. So we earn revenues that way. We also have you know, childcare, where there's some subsidized costs there. And so again, there's many that we you know, where possible and where appropriate, we will look to user fees to help us with that. There's say a little bit of a mixed school of thought on user fees, but really there are some advantages to it, and they can be non-financial and non-financial advantages. So one of the things is it can promote fairness with people who use the service, whether they use it or if they use it, they pay for it. If they don't, they don't. So it can kind of bring a fairness to that. And the example I like to use for this one, I'm sorry, Director of IDS, but is bag tags. So if you have more garbage output, you pay more in the fees, but if you have less, you pay less. So it just kind of, it goes with the behavior as well. So then residents may have more choices in whether or not they use or how much they use that service. And it can also, fees can also influence behavior. So again, sticking with, I'll say, the bag tag even option, you know, it can have people reducing their waste, or it can have them you know, just conserving or being more conscious and aware of their outputs in that service area. It can also mitigate tax increases where the municipal service is optional and where not everybody's going to take advantage of it or use it, or where only a small subset of residents access it. So an example might be offering the ability to make a photocopy at City Hall or something like that. It's just kind of helps to offset some of the costs that we have anyway, but not everybody's going to use that. So so the use of user fees is a philosophical question of really who should pay for what services. And should it be only the specific users of the service, or should it be all residents? It's not always easy. This is one of the areas that's pretty tricky for councils because there's cases where the service is mandated potentially, or it's deemed as necessary, but that on a per user basis, if we were to go with full cost recovery, it just wouldn't be feasible. Recreation programs is a good example of that. You know, transit's another one. So it's things where, you know, it really comes down to what degree do we want to have the user pay for the service, and to what degree do we want to subsidize that with the taxation side of things. So that's just a bit of background on user fees. But aside from user fees, we have other sorts of revenues that we try to tap into wherever possible. That would include grants, sometimes particularly with specific projects or specific initiatives, there might be donations involved. There's interest revenues that we use from our investments, and any cash balances. We try to actively manage our cash so that we are generating revenue from that. There might be other opportunities for us to recover revenues where we have rental or lease agreements, recovering from third parties where we've either had a shared service or where there's been something that's been a direct result of, say, a specific user creating a cost that should be borne by a specific person or entity. And then we also use our internal funds where we can, reserves and reserve funds, to mitigate any significant fluctuations in taxes or in dealing with things like one-time type of costs or expenses that aren't expected to recur. So we talk a little bit about reserves and reserve funds, and really there's a difference between the two. So I want to kind of give a bit of a sense of that. Reserves generally refer to our general operations. So things like we will have reserves I referred to earlier as a tax stabilization reserve. We have other reserves that are for operational purposes, say like to fund, for example, sick time or WSIB claims or election things that only happen once in a while. So these are more like operational in nature. And so they're classified or they're referred to as reserves because they are considered part of the general operations. Reserve funds are different in the sense that they're usually for a very explicit purpose. They can be both obligatory in nature, like I referenced earlier, gas tax funds or even development charges can be obligatory. So they're restricted in the sense that they can only be used for very specific purposes or projects. Or they can be discretionary, which is like most of the city's capital reserves that we have, where we've established reserves, for example, for water or for fleet or for anything else that we have capital reserves for, but it's discretionary to the degree that council could potentially change the use of those reserves for something else or redirect them or change the reserve from one type to another. So those are those are usually done through council direction or resolution or through a policy change, which would usually be what I would recommend if we were going to do something that drastic, but because we've got an established sort of system going on. So yeah, so we use these terms interchangeably, but it's just worth mentioning because it shows up in our financial statement reporting, but also, you know, we're talking about sort of what the purpose is for them. So most of the capital reserve funds are monies that have been derived either from taxes in previous years. We've been building that reserve fund from taxation, or they're from grants that we've received but not yet spent, or it could be residual funding that was left over from something that just wasn't reallocated to anything else. So money that's transferred to or from the reserves is always authorized by council. Either it's through the budget process or by following the policy framework. So our reserve and reserve fund policy does have certain reserves where it says that, you know, if there's a surplus, for example, in winter maintenance, then we would transfer that surplus into a winter maintenance reserve so that we would have that for future years. So there are some that are dictated or prescribed by the policy. Money transfers to the reserve funds are usually done through the operating budget process. And as we talked about earlier, they represent a line item in many of the divisions, or they're done at year end as a result of either projects not yet completed. We're putting the money back in a reserve. We're putting potentially divisional surpluses for legislation for water, wastewater into the reserve fund. And transfers from the reserve fund typically come out as part of the capital funding for the capital program for a budget year, or by a specific resolution of council that can happen at any point in time through the year. So if something is planned to be funded from a reserve or reserve fund and the project doesn't happen, either due to timing, supply chain issues, or whatever, the funds will stay in the reserve. And that's why sometimes we don't do the transfers out of the reserve until the end of the year. So we would then know at that point what the project status is. Outside of the budget process, a department might come along at some point during the year and recommend the use of a specific reserve or reserve fund to pay for something that's arisen through the year. This